My name is Kyrie Wade, 32 years old, a captain in the United States Army. That day was supposed to be a warm and happy Thanksgiving dinner, but instead my parents gave me a special gift. Inside wasn't what I expected. It was a notice for my brother's $250,000 debt from gambling. My father glared at me and said, "You will pay this debt." I firmly refused. Immediately, he threw his wine glass in my face, soaking my dress uniform in red like blood. My mother screamed, "If you don't pay your brother's debt, you are no longer my daughter. Get out of here." I stood there, stunned, the wine dripping from my chin, unable to believe this was my family. If you were in that situation, would you suffer in silence or stand up for yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments. Before I tell my story, hit the like button if you believe personal honor is more valuable than any blind obligation, and subscribe to witness a perfectly planned counterattack. I don't remember walking out the door. My body simply executed a retreat, a muscle memory of putting one foot in front of the other. What I do remember, what's burned into my mind, is the sound of the front door slamming shut. It wasn't just a slam, it was a final, heavy thud. A percussive crack like a mercy shot, ending any foolish hope that this was all a terrible mistake. I was left standing on the porch. The sharp Idaho November air cut through my uniform, a biting cold that went straight to the bone. But I couldn't feel it. The only sensation was the stinging heat on my cheek where the wine glass had struck, a burn of humiliation that felt far hotter than the freezing air. A grotesque perfume hung around me, the cloying sweetness of Cabernet mixed with the savory scents of roast turkey and pumpkin pie. It was a nauseating combination of manufactured warmth and brutal truth. My gaze was drawn to the large bay window. The lights inside cast a warm, golden glow on the porch, framing a perfect portrait of American family life. And there they were. My family. They had already sat back down, the scene resetting itself as if I were a momentary glitch that had been resolved. I watched, frozen, as my mother, Susan, reached across the table with a serving spoon. She scooped a fluffy pile of mashed potatoes and gently placed it onto Derek's plate. My father, David, resumed carving the turkey. In that single casual motion, I understood. I had been excised, erased. I was a plate cleared from the table, a name scratched off a list. I no longer existed. My legs finally obeyed, carrying me stiffly to my Jeep Wrangler at the curb. My hands, which I trusted to field strip a rifle in the dark, trembled so violently I could barely fit the key into the ignition. On the third try, the engine turned over, and the dome light flickered on, illuminating the cab in a harsh glow. And there it was, a dark, sprawling stain of red wine blossoming across the chest of my Army service uniform. This uniform was my armor. It represented years of sweat and sacrifice, a discipline I had forged to protect myself from the chaos of the very family who had just desecrated it. Every ribbon, every polished brass button, was a testament to a life of honor I had built for myself. Now it was soiled not by desert dust or training mud, but by the casual contempt of my own father. It wasn't just wine, it was a visible mark of shame. I grabbed a crumpled napkin from the console and began scrubbing at the stain in a frantic, useless gesture. The damp wool only seemed to absorb the color more deeply, the stain spreading like the betrayal itself, seeping into every thread. The pressure in my chest became a toxic, suffocating mix of fury and humiliation. My fist shot out, connecting hard with the steering wheel. The impact sent a sharp pain up my arm, a welcome distraction, but a scream remained trapped in my throat, a silent, choking agony. I put the Jeep in drive, pulling away with no destination. Outside, snowflakes began to fall, hesitant at first, then growing into a thick, swirling curtain of white. The windshield wipers swished back and forth in a frantic rhythm, fighting a losing battle against the storm, just as I was against the images in my mind. The radio, which I'd left on, suddenly broke through my daze. A sentimental country song about coming home for Thanksgiving, about the unconditional love of family. With a surge of rage, I slammed my hand against the power button. The sudden silence was a mercy. The entire world seemed to be celebrating the very thing I had just lost. a universe conspiring to mock my isolation. Through the whiteout, I saw the glowing sign of a gas station and instinctively pulled in, parking away from the pumps. I cut the engine. The only sounds were its ticking and the soft patter of snow against the glass. I was an island. I thought back to my tour in Afghanistan, to the vast, empty desert nights. I'd felt a sharp loneliness there, born of distance. But this was a hollow, echoing void. This was the loneliness of being unwanted by the people who were supposed to want you most. It was colder and more terrifying than any desert. In the profound silence of my Jeep, cocooned by the storm, a single word began to echo. Why? Why did they treat me like this? Why was Derek always forgiven, always rescued, while I was always expected to carry the weight? The answer, I knew with a chilling certainty, wasn't in the shattered wineglass or the new debt. That was just the latest battle. The answer was buried deeper, scattered across 32 years of smaller injustices and invisible wounds I had tried to forget. The old scars I thought had faded beneath the crisp fabric of my uniform began to ache with a fresh, sharp pain. To understand the ambush that had just occurred, I had to review the entire map of this long, undeclared war. And I knew, sitting there as the snow piled up around me, that it had all started long before tonight. Sitting in the cold silence of my Jeep, the question why kept echoing. It wasn't a question seeking a logical answer, it was a cry from a much younger version of myself, a ghost who had been asking that same question for years. The storm outside seemed to blur the line between now and then, and the memories began to surface, not as a flood, but as a series of sharp, distinct snapshots, the foundational posts of this 32-year war. The first memory to break through the haze was from the summer I turned 10. It was a summer that smelled of freshly cut grass and tasted of cheap lemonade. I'd spent all of July and August mowing lawns and pulling weeds for our neighbors, saving every single dollar in a worn-out coffee can under my bed. My goal was a brand new metallic blue Schwinn bicycle I'd seen in the window of the local bike shop. It had glittering tassels on the handlebars and a white basket. To me, it wasn't just a bike, it was a trophy. It was the first truly valuable thing I had ever earned for myself. A week after I brought it home, polished and perfect, it vanished. I found out Derek had taken it for a joyride without asking. He and his friends had tried to build a ramp, and the bike ended up at the bottom of a ravine, its frame bent and twisted. When I confronted him, crying hot, angry tears, my father didn't scold him. He didn't even make him apologize. He just put a heavy hand on my shoulder, his voice calm and dismissive. "Boys will be boys, Kyrie," he said, as if that explained everything. "You're the big sister. Be generous. I'll buy you another one." He never did. And that day I learned my first lesson in family economics. My labor was disposable, my property was communal, and my heartbreak was less important than protecting my brother from the slightest discomfort of accountability. That memory faded, replaced by another, sharper sting of injustice. I was 18, a high school graduate with a partial scholarship to the local community college. It was a good scholarship, but it didn't cover everything. To make up the difference, I worked 30 hours a week as a waitress at a Greasy Spoon diner downtown. My life was a blur of classes, homework, and the smell of fried onions, ending each night with exhausted feet and tips stuffed into a jar. That same year, my parents withdrew a substantial amount from their savings to pay Derek's full tuition at a private university out of state, a place he'd chosen because of its party reputation. He dropped out after one semester, citing creative differences with his professors. One evening, exhausted from a double shift, I gathered the courage to ask my mother about the disparity. Why was my path paved with struggle while his was paved with their savings? She just smiled, that placid, infuriating smile of hers, the one that made you feel like you were being unreasonable. "Oh, Kyrie, you're so strong and independent," she said, her tone dripping with false admiration. "I've always known you'd be fine on your own. Your brother, he just needs our help a little more." It wasn't a compliment, it was a curse. It was the justification they used to abandon me to my own devices, a punishment for the very strength they claimed to admire. I was capable, so I was left to fend for myself. He was not, so he was coddled and rescued. It was another lesson. My resilience wasn't a virtue to them, it was an excuse. The diner disappeared, and a far more painful scene took its place. The parade grounds at West Point, graduation day. It was supposed to be one of the proudest moments of my life. I had survived 4 years of grueling physical and academic challenges. I had earned my commission. Months in advance, I had mailed invitations home, picturing them sitting in the stands, sharing in my achievement. They didn't come. The excuse, delivered over a brief, unapologetic phone call from my mother, was that the date conflicted with the championship game of Derek's semi-pro football league. A league of weekend warriors playing for beer money and bragging rights. I stood there on that vast green field, a sea of black, gray, and white uniforms, surrounded by thousands of cheering families. In that moment, I had never felt more profoundly alone. The joy of my accomplishment was hollowed out by their absence. But then, through the blur of my own disappointment, I saw a familiar figure standing near the back of the crowd. He was ramrod straight, his old Marine Corps bearing still evident despite his age. It was my grandfather, Arthur. He had driven for 2 days straight, all the way from Idaho to New York, to be there. After the ceremony, he found me, pulled me into a fierce, wiry hug, and pressed a small, heavy box into my hand. Inside was a beautiful Mont Blanc pen. "Time to write your own story, Captain," he said, his voice thick with emotion. It was the first time anyone in my family had called me by my rank. In that moment, surrounded by the weight of their rejection, his presence was a lifeline. His recognition was the only one that mattered. I knew then, with absolute clarity, who my real family was. Back in the cold, dark reality of the gas station, these memories clicked into place like pieces of a puzzle, forming a single, coherent image of systemic injustice. Tonight's dinner wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a 32-year campaign. They had never seen me as a daughter to be nurtured. They saw me as a utility, a safe investment, a backup plan for their failures. The deep, aching pain I'd felt began to cool, hardening into a cold, clear anger. I would not let them define me or my worth for one more second. My hand found the ignition key. I turned it. The engine roared to life, a defiant sound in the quiet of the storm. The smell of gasoline and cold, wet snow filled the cab. I wasn't going back. Not to that house, not to that town, not to that role they had assigned me. I was going to drive the 10 hours straight back to Fort Carson, back to the life I had built with my own 2 hands. Back to a place where my rank meant something, where my word was my bond. This battle wasn't over. It had just begun. The 10-hour drive from Idaho Falls to Fort Carson was a waking nightmare, a blurry ordeal fueled by bitter gas station coffee and the relentless replay of painful memories. I drove straight through the night, my hands clenched on the steering wheel as if it were the only solid thing in a world that had just dissolved beneath me. The endless stretch of I-80 became a ribbon of asphalt leading me away from my past. Every mile marker that flashed by in my headlights felt like a small victory, a quiet affirmation of the choice I had made. I was retreating, yes, but I was retreating forward. As the first hints of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, the majestic, jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains emerged from the darkness. Seeing them, solid and unyielding against the pale morning light, I felt the tight knot in my chest loosen just a fraction. It was a fragile sense of relief, but it was real. I had made it out. I was back in my territory. The feeling intensified as I drove through the main gate of Fort Carson. The young soldier in the guard booth, barely out of his teens, snapped to attention and gave me a crisp salute. "Welcome back, Captain," he said, his voice clear and respectful. That simple, professional courtesy, that acknowledgement of who I was and what I had earned, nearly broke me. A lump formed in my throat so thick I could only nod in return. Here, I wasn't the daughter who had failed her family. I was Captain Wade. I was an officer. I was home. I finally reached my small, off-base apartment, feeling utterly depleted, a hollowed-out version of myself. The stale, sour smell of dried wine still clung to me, a phantom reminder of the night's humiliation. The dark stain on my uniform seemed to mock me from the passenger seat. I was too exhausted to even think about what to do next. All I wanted was to crawl into bed and let the world disappear. But before I could even take off my boots, the doorbell chimed. My first thought was a jolt of panic. Them. They followed me. But that was irrational. My second thought was irritation. I didn't want to see anyone. Still, I dragged myself to the door and looked through the peephole. It was Maria, Sergeant Davis's wife, my NCO. I opened the door. She stood there, a kind smile on her face, holding a casserole dish covered in foil. The warmth radiating from it was the first genuine warmth I'd felt in 24 hours. "Dave figured you might be back," she said softly, her eyes full of a quiet understanding that asked no questions. "We saved you a plate. There's turkey and some sweet potato casserole." She didn't ask why I was home early. She didn't ask why my eyes were red and swollen. She didn't comment on the faint smell of alcohol. She just brought food and warmth, the two most fundamental offerings of care, the very things my own family had weaponized against me. I took the dish from her, my hands clumsy. "Thank you, Maria," I managed to whisper, the words catching in my throat. She just squeezed my arm gently and left. That evening, the Davises invited me over. Their house was a chaotic symphony of life, a stark contrast to the sterile, oppressive silence of my parents' home. Their two young kids were chasing each other around the living room, their laughter echoing off the walls. Toys were scattered across the floor. It was messy and loud and wonderfully, beautifully alive. We sat around their dinner table, which was still laden with the festive remnants of their Thanksgiving meal. The Davises' youngest son, a rambunctious 5-year-old, chattered away, telling me all about a new Lego set he'd gotten. Maria kept refilling my glass of iced tea. They included me without making me the center of attention. They just made space for me. Throughout the meal, Sergeant Davis, a man I respected immensely for his quiet competence, only said one thing directly about my situation. He looked at me across the table, his expression serious but kind. "Sometimes, Captain," he said, his voice low and steady, "a tactical retreat is the bravest move a soldier can make." That was it. That was all I needed to hear. No judgment. No prying questions. Just validation from a fellow soldier, spoken in a language we both understood. He had reframed my shame as courage. For the first time since that wine glass shattered, I felt the crushing weight on my chest lift. I felt safe. And as I looked around at this loud, loving, ordinary family, I realized this was a real Thanksgiving. It had nothing to do with bloodlines. It had everything to do with loyalty. A few days later, I was trying to fall back into the rhythm of my life. Work, gym, sleep. I hung my freshly dry-cleaned uniform back in the closet, the stain gone, but the memory of it still there. On the wall opposite my desk, a plaque with my unit's motto hung, "Sustain the fight." It was a logistician's creed, a promise to keep the front lines supplied. But now it felt like a personal mandate. Just as I was starting to feel a semblance of normal again, my phone buzzed. An unknown number with an Idaho area code. My heart hammered against my ribs. It had to be them, calling to launch the next wave of their assault. My thumb hovered over the decline button. But something, a flicker of intuition, made me answer. I braced myself for my father's roar or my mother's manipulative whine. Instead, a familiar, gravelly voice came through the line. "Kyrie, it's Grandpa." His voice was tense, urgent, not his usual calm, measured tone. "I have some intelligence you need to be aware of right now," he said. And the word intelligence made the officer in me snap to attention. "This is more complicated than what they told you." I realized then that his silence at the dinner table hadn't been agreement. It had been reconnaissance. And now, the cavalry was calling. "Go ahead, Grandpa," I said. The sound of my own voice surprised me. The weary, wounded tone from the gas station was gone, replaced by the clipped, focused cadence of an officer receiving a battlefield report. I sat ramrod straight on my sofa, my back no longer slumped in exhaustion. My phone was pressed firmly to my ear as if it were a military handset. First thing, my grandfather began, his voice a low, steady transmission, stripped of any emotional static. He was delivering facts, not sentiment. That $250,000 debt isn't from some bad business deal. That was a lie, a piece of fiction crafted specifically for your consumption. He paused for a beat, letting the word lie land with its full weight. Your brother has been burning through money in casinos in Vegas and Reno for the better part of a year. I made a call to an old Marine buddy of mine, Jack Riley, who's been in casino security for 30 years. He made some discreet inquiries. Derek owes money to loan sharks, Kyrie, the kind of people who don't send polite reminder notices. An icy chill traced a path down my spine, a cold far deeper and more invasive than the Idaho snow. This wasn't just Derek's usual pattern of irresponsibility and failure. This was a calculated deception. My parents, my entire family, had sat around a table and constructed a sympathetic narrative, the struggling, down-on-his-luck entrepreneur, to hide the sordid, shameful reality of their son's gambling addiction. They hadn't just asked for my help. They had attempted to manipulate me with a sob story. They had insulted my intelligence, assuming that the bonds of family would blind me to the inconsistencies, assuming I would swallow their story without question. The raw hurt I felt was swiftly being overtaken by a different kind of emotion, a cold, sharp-edged anger. And there's more, he continued, his voice a relentless current of information, giving me no time to process the last revelation before delivering the next. Your sister-in-law, Melissa. Her knowledge of your finances wasn't a coincidence. She didn't just happen to know. She abused her position as a personal banker at Idaho First Community Bank. She pulled an unauthorized, off-the-record printout of your savings account statement and gave it directly to your parents. That's how they knew the exact figure. That's how they knew you had over $700,000 saved up. That's not just unethical, Kyrie. That is a federal crime under the Bank Secrecy Act. The fire of my anger turned to ice. A chilling clarity washed over me, pushing the emotional turmoil aside. This wasn't a desperate, last-minute plea for help born of panic. This was a premeditated operation. They had conducted surveillance on me, on my life, on my finances. They had assessed my assets like a hostile force evaluating a target's resources. They had planned their attack with tactical precision, choosing the time and place where I would be most vulnerable. The Thanksgiving dinner wasn't a family gathering. It was the chosen ambush site, the kill zone where they thought nostalgia and guilt would force me to surrender. They had treated me not as a daughter, but as a resource to be exploited. But this is the worst of it, my grandfather's voice dropped, taking on a heavy, somber tone that made the hair on my arms stand up. And I'm sorry you have to hear it from me, because it speaks to a deeper rot. This isn't the first time they've bailed him out. 6 months ago, your parents secretly took out a second mortgage on the house. The house my parents, your great-grandparents, left to them, free and clear. They leveraged their own future to pay off $100,000 of Derek's previous gambling debts. He let that sink in, a silence stretching across the phone line before he delivered the final, devastating blow. The bank is about to foreclose, Kyrie. They've run out of rope. The $250,000 they demanded from you. Only part of it was for the loan sharks. The rest was to make the balloon payment to the bank and save the house. Silence. A profound, ringing silence filled my small apartment. I stared blankly at the wall, at the framed unit plaque with its simple, powerful motto, "Sustain the fight." The full, monstrous scope of their betrayal finally came into focus. I was not being asked to save my brother. I was being ordered to finance a cover-up. A cover-up for Derek's addiction, for Melissa's crime, and for my parents' own catastrophic enablement and foolish decisions. They were willing to sacrifice my entire future, everything I had worked and bled for, not just for their golden child, but to save themselves from the consequences of their own actions. They would throw me off a cliff to keep from losing their house and, more importantly, their reputation in the community. For a long moment after my grandfather finished speaking, I couldn't form a word. I just breathed, a long, slow, deliberate breath in and an even slower one out. The officer in me was taking over, compartmentalizing the emotional trauma, processing the raw data into actionable intelligence. The pain was still there, a deep throbbing ache in my chest, but now it was overlaid with a cold, crystalline clarity. As a child, my grandfather, a man of few words but deep faith, would often quote the Bible to me. One verse had always stuck in my mind. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. I had always thought it meant freedom in a spiritual sense. I never understood its tactical power until this very moment. The truth was brutal, agonizing, but it was also liberating. It severed the last fraying threads of misplaced familial obligation and suffocating guilt. I was no longer the wounded daughter, crying in a gas station parking lot. I was a deceived officer. I was a soldier whose trust had been violated, whose position had been compromised by the very people who should have been my most steadfast rear guard. "Thank you, Grandpa," I said, and my voice was as steady as a rock. It held no tears, no tremor, only cold, hard resolve. "You've given me the ammunition I need." That phone call changed the entire nature of the conflict. It transformed my personal act of self-preservation into a righteous mission. This was no longer about money or hurt feelings. This was about honor. It was about truth. It was about a justice they had arrogantly assumed they were above. They had underestimated their target. They had mistaken my loyalty for weakness and my independence for an endless resource, and I would not let them win. The morning after my grandfather's call, I woke up with a singular purpose. The fog of grief and confusion had lifted, replaced by the cold, clear light of strategy. I made a pot of strong black coffee and transformed my small kitchen into a tactical operations center. I cleared the table and spread out a large sheet of butcher paper, drawing a large circle in the center with a black Sharpie. Inside it, I wrote, "Operation, Defensive Perimeter." This was my mission now. From the central circle, I drew 4 main branches. The first, I labeled Threat Assessment, the Wade family. The second was Assets to Protect, Finances, Honor, Career, Future. The third was Allies, Grandpa Arthur, Sergeant Davis. The fourth, and most important, was Course of Action. For the first time in days, my hands were steady. My mind was sharp. The panic that had been a constant low hum in the back of my mind was gone, replaced by a focused calm. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a commander analyzing a hostile situation. I was doing exactly what the Army had trained me to do for over a decade: break down a complex problem, identify variables, assess risks, and formulate a clear, actionable plan. The emotional chaos was being contained and replaced by the structured order of military logic. I took a sip of coffee and stared at my battle map. That night, I also pulled my old copy of Sun Tzu's The Art of War off the bookshelf, a book familiar to nearly every officer. The line that stood out was simple and powerful. Know your enemy and know yourself, and you will not be imperiled in 100 battles. I finally understood what that truly meant. The first item on my action plan was to secure legal counsel. I made an appointment with the Judge Advocate General's Corps on post, the JAG office. I was assigned to a Major Evans, a sharp, no-nonsense woman with tired but intelligent eyes. I sat across from her desk and delivered my situation report, laying out the facts concisely, chronologically, and without emotion, just as if I were briefing a superior officer. I detailed the demand for money, the gambling debts, and the fabricated business story. But when I got to the part about my sister-in-law, Melissa, accessing my bank account, Major Evans stopped taking notes. She put her pen down, folded her hands, and looked at me directly. Her gaze was intense. "Captain Wade," she said, her voice firm, "what your sister-in-law did isn't just unethical. It's a felony. A violation of the Bank Secrecy Act and multiple federal privacy laws." She explained the legal ramifications, the potential for fines and even prison time for Melissa, and the liability the bank faced for employing her. She laid out the clear legal boundaries that had been crossed. After giving me a list of civilian attorneys she recommended in Colorado Springs, her professional demeanor softened slightly. "I can't represent you in a civil matter, you know that," she said. "But I strongly advise you to get a good lawyer. And listen, Carrie. It was the first time she had used my first name, the shift in tone creating an unexpected bond between us. I had to cut ties with a toxic family member myself a few years ago. It's hard, but you're doing the right thing. That small moment of shared experience, that validation from a fellow female officer of a higher rank, felt like a crucial reinforcement of my position. I walked out of her office feeling stronger, more resolute. My next step was intelligence gathering. Armed with Major Evans's advice and my grandfather's intel, I began building my case file. I called my grandfather and asked him to securely email me any documentation he had. Names, dates, anything from his friend in casino security that could substantiate Derek's debts. He agreed without hesitation. Then I made a difficult but necessary call to the corporate security office of my bank. I reported a potential unauthorized access of my account by one of their employees, Melissa Wade, at their Idaho Falls branch. I was calm, professional, and firm. I provided my account details and requested a formal internal investigation, asking for all access logs related to my account for the past 6 months. The security officer on the other end was initially skeptical, but my confident, precise language made him take the matter seriously. He assured me they would investigate immediately. I documented everything. Every phone call was logged with the date, time, and name of the person I spoke to. Every email was saved and backed up to a secure drive. I was building an irrefutable dossier. Each piece of evidence was like another round of ammunition being loaded into a magazine. I wasn't looking for a fight. But if they brought the war to me, I would be fully armed and ready to defend my ground. As I expected, the enemy didn't remain silent for long. A few days later, my mother called. Her voice was syrupy sweet, a tone she always used for manipulation. "Kyrie, sweetie, have you had some time to think things over? Your father was just a little hot-headed. You know how he gets. The whole family is just waiting for you to do the right thing. You wouldn't want your brother to get into real trouble, would you?" It wasn't a question. It was a veiled threat, wrapped in the language of familial concern. I remained silent. "And your father said," she continued, her voice losing a bit of its sweetness and gaining a hard edge, "that if you don't transfer the money by the end of the month, he's going to drive down to Fort Carson himself. He'll have a little chat with your commanding officer about what an ungrateful, disloyal daughter you are." I gripped my phone, my knuckles turning white. They had just escalated. This was a direct threat against my career, my honor, the very foundation of my life. They were preparing to attack me in my own fortress. The time for defense was over. It was time to show them the perimeter was electrified. "Okay, Mom," I said, my voice as cold and flat as a frozen lake. "Let him." 2 days after my mother's failed attempt at intimidation, my father called. He didn't bother with a greeting. His voice was a low growl, the sound of a predator tired of stalking its prey. "I'm giving you 24 hours, Carrie," he snarled into the phone. 24 hours to wire $250,000 into Derek's account. If you don't, I swear to God, I will be in my truck, and I will drive to Fort Carson. I will walk into your colonel's office and tell him exactly what kind of irresponsible, disloyal officer he has under his command. You'll be so embarrassed you'll have to resign your commission. I stood motionless in my kitchen, the phone pressed to my ear. My dog tags, hanging cool against my skin beneath my t-shirt, felt heavier, more solid. They were a small, tangible anchor in the storm he was trying to create. But inside me, there was no storm. The hurricane of emotion, the shock, the pain, the humiliation, had passed. All that remained was the cold, quiet calm of a battlefield just before the fighting starts. I had been preparing for this call. I was ready. "No," I said. My voice was even, devoid of heat, but as solid and unyielding as granite. "I will not be transferring 1 single cent." There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. It was as if the simple, 2-letter word had short-circuited his brain. He was so accustomed to my eventual compliance, to my bending under pressure, that my flat refusal was incomprehensible to him. "What did you just say to me?" he finally roared, his voice cracking with disbelief and rage. "Dad," I said, cutting him off, my voice still level. For the first time in my 32 years, I seized control of the conversation. I know it's gambling debt. I know you and Mom took out a second mortgage on the house 6 months ago to cover his last round of losses. I know that Melissa illegally accessed my private bank records and gave them to you. With each fact I laid out, the silence on his end grew deeper, more profound. I continued, pressing my advantage. So, let's consider the strategic outcomes here. Do you really want me to present all of this information to my colonel? Along with a report of you threatening a commissioned officer? Or perhaps I should share this file with the Idaho Falls Police Department? I'm sure they'd be very interested in financial extortion. And what about the board of directors at Melissa's bank? I imagine they have a zero-tolerance policy for employees committing federal crimes. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The only sound was his ragged, astonished breathing. For his entire life, his power was built on a foundation of bluster, intimidation, and my conditioned silence. In the span of 30 seconds, I had bulldozed that foundation to dust. You're threatening me? He stammered, his voice losing its thunder, replaced by a pathetic sputtering. No, I replied, my voice as cold and sharp as steel. I am not threatening you. I am informing you of my available courses of action based on credible intelligence. In the Army, we call that strategy. You, of all people, should understand that. I let the implication of his own lack of honor hang in the air. Don't you use that officer tone with me, he bellowed, a desperate attempt to regain his footing. Is that what the Army taught you? To turn your back on your own family? That was his final, fatal mistake. He had crossed a line he could never uncross. He had taken the one thing I was most proud of, the institution that had given me a code to live by, and tried to use it as a weapon against me. No, I said, and this time my voice carried the full weight of my conviction. The Army taught me about honor. It taught me about integrity and duty. It taught me that you don't cover up the mistakes of your subordinates. You hold them accountable, a concept that you and the rest of this family seem to have forgotten. I took a breath, my fingers tracing the edge of my dog tags. Wade, Kyrie, L-O-P-O-S. This is me. This is who I am. No one takes this from me. So, you listen to me, and you listen closely, I said, my voice dropping into a command tone. This was my final order. You will never call me asking for money again. You will never threaten my career again. In fact, you will not contact me again, for any reason. This is the line. The defensive perimeter has been established. If you or anyone else in the family attempts to cross it, I will execute every single course of action I just outlined. Do you understand me? He didn't answer. There was nothing left but the sound of his impotent, furious breathing on the other end of the line. He had no more threats, no more ammunition. I didn't wait for a reply. It wasn't a negotiation. I ended the call. A profound, absolute silence filled my kitchen. I had done it. I had faced the tyrant. I had held my ground. I had established the boundaries of my own sovereign nation. And for the first time in my entire life, standing alone in my small apartment, I felt completely, utterly, and gloriously free. If you've ever had to draw a hard line with someone you loved, and you know how much courage that takes, please support this story by hitting the like button. And let me know in the comments by just writing, I understand. Your support means the world. After I ended the call with my father, my phone fell silent. Utterly silent. For the first 24 hours, that silence was a profound relief. It was the calm after a violent storm, the quiet hum of an apartment no longer under siege. There were no demanding texts, no manipulative calls, no barrage of accusations. It felt like freedom. But as one day bled into the next, the silence began to change its nature. It grew heavier, more ominous. It was no longer the silence of peace, but the unnerving quiet before a new ambush. I found myself checking my phone constantly, my stomach twisting with a familiar, toxic mix of hope and dread. Some small, younger part of me, the 10-year-old girl who just wanted her bike back, still harbored a foolish hope for an apology, for some flicker of remorse or acknowledgement. But the officer in me, the part that had seen battle, knew better. This was not a surrender. This was a tactical regrouping. They were gathering their forces and planning a different kind of assault. The attack, when it came, was from an unexpected flank. An Idaho number I didn't recognize flashed on my screen. I answered cautiously. It was my Aunt Carol, my mother's younger sister. Her voice, usually warm and cheerful, was dripping with a kind of pious, self-righteous disappointment. "Kyrie, I just got off the phone with your mother, and I can't believe what I'm hearing," she began, without even a hello. "Threatening to send your own family to prison over a little bit of money? Have you forgotten who raised you, who put a roof over your head? I think all that money and that fancy uniform have turned you into a cold, heartless person." I stood there, speechless, the phone feeling like a block of ice against my ear. The strategy became sickeningly clear. They wouldn't face me directly again. My facts were too strong, my resolve too firm. Instead, they had launched a smear campaign. They were waging a war of information, twisting the narrative to paint me as the villain of their story. They were broadcasting their carefully edited version of the truth to the entire network of our relatives and their friends back home, ensuring that everyone heard their side before I ever had a chance to speak. The pain from Aunt Carol's words was sharper, in a way, than the sting of my father's wine glass. He had attacked my body and my uniform. But this was an assault on my character, on my name. I had spent my entire adult life meticulously building a reputation based on honor, integrity, and service. In a matter of days, they were trying to demolish it with whispers and lies. A fresh wave of anger surged through me, but this time, it was laced with a terrifying sense of impotence. How could I fight this? How could I defend myself against rumors spreading hundreds of miles away, against the quiet judgments of people I had known my whole life? I had won the direct confrontation, but I was losing the war for public opinion, or at least, the opinion of the small town that had raised me. I felt surrounded by invisible enemies, trapped by a narrative I couldn't control. I sat alone in my quiet apartment, the victor of a battle who now felt more isolated than ever. That night, I couldn't sleep. The silence of my home felt suffocating. I picked up my copy of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations, a book that had gotten me through long nights in Afghanistan. I read a passage I had underlined years ago. "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." The words were a comfort, a reminder to focus on my own integrity, not their lies. But it was hard. Their attack was personal, and it was working. Just when I felt my resolve beginning to fray, my phone rang again. It was my grandfather. "I've been hearing things," he said, his voice the calm, steady anchor I desperately needed. "They're spreading stories all over town, painting you as the ungrateful daughter who abandoned her family in their time of need." He paused. "Don't you worry about it. Lies have short legs. They can't outrun the truth." I listened, a lump forming in my throat. Just hearing his unwavering belief in me felt like a shield. "Next week," he continued, a new steely edge to his voice, "is the annual VFW meeting for the local Marine Corps League detachment in Idaho Falls. Your father will be there. He loves playing the proud patriot in front of those men." Another pause, this one filled with strategic intent. "And I'll be there too. I think it's about time those men heard an honest-to-God after-action report on the situation." The call ended, but the hope he had ignited burned bright in the darkness of my apartment. The war wasn't over. They had chosen their battlefield, the court of public opinion. And now, my grandfather was choosing his. There was going to be one final public stage, and this time, I wouldn't be fighting alone. I drove the 10 hours back to Idaho Falls, but this time, it wasn't a retreat. I wasn't fleeing a battle. I was moving to a strategic observation post. I didn't go to the VFW hall. Instead, I parked my Jeep across the street in the shadowed corner of a deserted parking lot, giving me a clear line of sight to the main entrance. I was there as a witness, not a participant. This was my grandfather's battlefield. Through the large front windows of the hall, I could see my father. He was in his element, holding a beer, standing in the middle of a circle of men his age, all of them wearing hats denoting their service: Navy, Air Force, Army. He was laughing, clapping them on the back, playing the part of the proud patriot, the proud father of a daughter serving as an army captain. My stomach churned at the sight of his hypocrisy. He was using my service, the very thing he had threatened to destroy, as a badge of honor for himself. It was disgusting. Then I saw my grandfather, Arthur Wade, walk in. He moved with a quiet dignity that commanded respect, without demanding it. He didn't engage with the crowd but found an empty table in the back corner and sat down, a silent, waiting presence. He caught my eye through the window and gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was the signal. All elements were in position. After about an hour of standard proceedings, the Pledge of Allegiance, a few announcements about upcoming events, the Master of Ceremonies, a retired Marine colonel with a booming voice, stepped up to the microphone. And now, he announced, we'd like to give the floor for a few words to one of our most distinguished members, a veteran of Chosin Reservoir, Sergeant Major Arthur Wade. A respectful silence fell over the room as my grandfather made his way slowly to the small stage. He stood at the podium, his posture still ramrod straight, and looked out over the faces of his peers. Brothers, he began, his voice raspy but clear, carrying through the hall without the need for a microphone. I'm not here tonight to talk about old wars. I'm here to talk about a battle happening right now. I'm here to talk about honor. I saw my father, who had been beaming with pride at the mention of his father's name, suddenly stiffen. A flicker of confusion, then alarm, crossed his face. This was not part of his script. Recently, my grandfather continued, his gaze sweeping the room. Some of you may have heard rumors circulating in our community. Rumors about my granddaughter, Captain Kyrie Wade of the United States Army. My father froze completely, his beer bottle held halfway to his lips. He looked like a man who had just realized the ground beneath his feet was a trapdoor. The story being told is that she is an ungrateful child. My grandfather's voice grew harder, each word a hammer blow. That she turned her back on her family in their time of need. But I am here tonight to set the record straight, because there is nothing a Marine hates more than a lie. A low murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The truth is that my son, David, he raised a hand and pointed directly at my father, who flinched as if struck, attempted to extort $250,000 from his daughter to pay off his son's gambling debts. And when that decorated Army captain refused, she was verbally assaulted, physically attacked, and thrown out of his house on Thanksgiving night. A collective gasp went through the room. Men turned in their seats, their friendly, beery expressions replaced by shock and disbelief, all staring at my father. My grandfather wasn't finished. His voice rose with righteous fury. The truth is that my granddaughter-in-law, a bank employee, committed a federal crime by illegally accessing Kyrie's private financial records. The truth is that they concocted a false story, a web of lies, to manipulate a commissioned officer of the United States Armed Forces. That is not the action of a family in need. That is the action of cowards and thieves. Every eye in that hall was now fixed on my father. His face had gone from a florid red to a pasty, sickly white. He opened his mouth, stammering, trying to form a denial, but no one was listening. The men around him, his friends, the veterans he so desperately sought to impress, were now looking at him with a uniform expression of cold, utter contempt. The performance was over. The verdict was in. My grandfather concluded, his voice ringing with finality. Honor isn't about hiding your shame. It's about having the courage to face the truth. He stepped down from the podium. He walked directly toward my father's table, but didn't slow down, passing him without a single glance as if he were a stranger. He walked straight out the front door and across the street to where I was waiting. He didn't say a word. He just came to my side of the Jeep and put a steady, warm hand on my shoulder. As I looked back at the hall, I saw my father, utterly alone in a room full of people, his social standing shattered in the space of 3 minutes. In that moment, I didn't feel the triumphant glee I'd expected. There was no joy, no sense of victory. Just a vast, quiet, and profound sense of relief. The weight I had been carrying my entire life had finally been lifted. The war was truly over. Just before my grandfather and I drove away, the door of the VFW hall opened. A couple of the older veterans, men I recognized as my grandfather's old friends, walked over. One of them, a man with a weathered face and a navy cap, leaned down to my window. He met my eyes and said, his voice full of respect, "Don't you worry, Captain. We get it. Honor is everything." He reached in and shook my hand. Their acceptance, their understanding, was the only verdict that mattered. It was the truest vindication I could have ever asked for. Driving back to Fort Carson after the VFW meeting, I had expected to feel a sense of triumph, a surge of righteous vindication. But as the miles passed, no such feeling came. Instead, as I settled back into the quiet routine of my life, a profound emptiness began to set in. The house of cards they had built had collapsed, but a part of me, a fundamental piece of my history, had collapsed with it. I had won the war, but in doing so, I had officially lost my family. Even a toxic family leaves a void when it's gone. I spent the next few days on a kind of emotional autopilot. I went to work, I led my platoon, I filled out paperwork, I went to the gym. But when I came home to my silent apartment each evening, the quiet that had once felt like freedom now felt like a heavy blanket. It wasn't the menacing silence of waiting for an attack anymore. It was just a sad, hollow quiet. I came to a difficult realization. Exposing the truth doesn't automatically heal the wound. It just stops the bleeding. The scar and the phantom pain that comes with it remains. About a week later, an envelope arrived in my mailbox. It was from Idaho, addressed in my mother's familiar looping cursive. My heart gave a sudden, sharp thump against my ribs. For a foolish, fleeting second, a tiny flicker of hope ignited inside me. Maybe the public humiliation had forced some kind of breakthrough. Maybe this was the letter of apology I had secretly, childishly, been waiting for my whole life. It wasn't. Inside were 4 pages, front and back, filled with her venomous, self-pitying script. It was a masterclass in blame-shifting and gaslighting. She accused me of publicly shaming my father, of destroying my brother's future, of gleefully tearing the family apart for my own selfish pride. She painted them as the victims, and me as the cold, calculating executioner. The letter ended with a final, poisoned dart. "You can have your money and your precious honor, Kyrie, but you will die alone." I read the entire thing, standing in the middle of my living room. And when I finished, I didn't cry. I didn't feel a surge of rage, I just felt a final, quiet clarity. It was the last piece of evidence I would ever need. They were never going to change. They were never going to see their own part in the destruction. They would forever be the heroes of their own tragic story. That evening, I took the letter out onto my small balcony. The sun was setting behind the Rockies, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. I took a Zippo lighter from my pocket, the one my grandfather had given me years ago, and flicked it open. The flame danced in the cool evening air. I touched the corner of the first page to the flame. I watched as the fire slowly consumed her words, turning the bitter accusations and twisted logic into blackened, curling ash. The angry looping script disappeared, one line at a time. When the last corner of the last page had burned away, I let the ashes fall from my fingers, and the wind carried them away into the twilight. This wasn't an act of hatred or revenge. It was a ritual. It was an act of letting go. I was letting go of the hope that they would ever be the family I needed them to be. I was letting go of the burden of responsibility for their happiness, and most importantly, I was letting go of the guilt they had spent a lifetime trying to weld to my soul. A few weeks later, I started attending a veteran support group on post. Sergeant Davis had recommended it. At first, I just listened. I heard stories of combat, of loss, of the difficult transition back to civilian life, but I also heard stories that sounded eerily like my own. Stories of families who didn't understand, who were dismissive, or who were the source of the deepest wounds of all. I realized I wasn't alone in this kind of battle, either. One night, I finally shared a condensed, anonymous version of my story. After the meeting, an older veteran, a retired Marine gunny with a kind, wrinkled face, came over to me. He put a hand on my shoulder. "Sounds like you've been through it, Captain," he said. "Let me tell you something it took me 60 years to learn. Forgiveness doesn't mean you're saying, what you did to me was okay. It means you're saying, what you did to me is no longer allowed to control me. His words hit me with the force of a revelation. They recalibrated my entire understanding of the word. I realized in that moment that I could forgive them, not for their sake, but for mine. I could forgive their weakness, their blindness, their profound selfishness. But that forgiveness didn't require reconciliation. It didn't require me to lower my defensive perimeter or pretend the war never happened. I could forgive them from a distance, from the safety of the life I had built. Forgiveness, I now understood, was the final act of taking back control. It was how I would achieve total command of my own mind. Standing on my balcony, looking out at the unwavering silhouette of the mountains, I finally felt the last of the internal conflict settle. The war was over. The aftershocks were fading. It was time to start building on the quiet ground. The next Thanksgiving, 1 year after the night that fractured my world, my apartment was not quiet. It was filled with warmth and noise and life. I had decided to host a dinner for soldiers from my unit who couldn't travel home for the holidays. My small living room was crowded with young men and women, their laughter echoing as they shared stories from home and traded playful insults about whose hometown had the better football team. The air smelled of roast turkey, cinnamon, and camaraderie. Sergeant Davis and Maria were there with their kids, who were running wild with excitement. And sitting in my most comfortable armchair, holding court with a couple of young lieutenants, was my grandfather. He had flown in from Idaho a few days earlier. At one point, he caught my eye from across the bustling room. He gestured with his chin at the scene, at the soldiers, at the Davises, at the joyful chaos. And a proud, gentle smile touched his lips. "Now this," he said to me later, his voice low and full of meaning. "This is a real unit." I looked around at the faces in the room, at the people who had offered me food when I was empty, who had given me validation when I was broken, who had stood by me without question. He was right. I had built my own family, a platoon forged not by blood but by respect, loyalty, and an unconditional love I had never known before. This was my fortress. This was my home. A few months into the new year, I received a call from a lawyer in Boise I had consulted. He was giving me a final update. My brother, Derek, had finally been forced to declare bankruptcy, his financial irresponsibility catching up to him in a way he could no longer escape. The bank had officially begun foreclosure proceedings on my parents' house, and Melissa, my sister-in-law, had been quietly terminated from her position at the bank following the conclusion of their internal investigation. As I listened, I waited for a feeling of satisfaction, of victory, to arrive. But it never came. There was no joy, no triumphant surge of, "I told you so." There was only a quiet, somber sense of an inevitable outcome, a grim justice. They were not my victims. They were the casualties of their own choices, of a lifetime of arrogance and deceit. The truth, as my grandfather had predicted, has a way of working its way to the surface, like a splinter being pushed out of the skin. My legacy in this story wasn't revenge. It was simply the truth. Life at Fort Carson continued, and my career, far from being destroyed, flourished. My story, in its vague, unspoken details, became something of a quiet legend among those who knew parts of it. My integrity had been tested under a different kind of fire, and I had not faltered. I was promoted to the rank of major. With the new rank came new responsibilities, including mentoring junior officers, fresh out of West Point and officer candidate school. I taught them about logistics, about supply chain management, about tactical readiness. But I also taught them other things. I taught them about setting personal boundaries, about the courage to protect their own honor when it was challenged, and about the most critical leadership skill of all, learning to lead yourself. In one mentoring session, a young lieutenant was struggling with a difficult personal decision. I looked at him and said, "Lieutenant, a soldier's highest duty is to the truth. And that starts with being true to yourself. Never compromise your integrity. Not for a mission, not for a promotion, and not for anyone else." And then, exactly 1 year to the day after that fateful Thanksgiving, I finally took the trip I'd planned. I woke up before dawn, packed my gear, and drove to the base of Pikes Peak. The hike was arduous, the air thinning with every upward step. But with each footfall on the rocky trail, I felt lighter. I stood alone on the summit, at over 14,000 feet, looking out at the endless expanse of the Rocky Mountains stretching to the horizon. The wind was fierce and cold, whipping at my face, but I felt a profound warmth spreading from within. I hadn't climbed this mountain to run away from anything. I had climbed it to celebrate my freedom, to celebrate the strength I had found in the wreckage of my past, to celebrate the quiet, unshakable person I had become. I was no longer the soldier just following orders, no longer the daughter desperately seeking approval. I was the supreme commander of my own life. And from this high, clear vantage point, looking east, I could see it with perfect clarity. The dawn was coming. That dawn I saw from the top of Pikes Peak wasn't just in the sky, it was inside me. My story is over, but I know that for many of you listening, your own climb is still underway. Please know that your past does not have to be your future. You have the right to draw your own lines and build your own fortress of peace. If you feel comfortable, share one word in the comments that describes the freedom you are fighting for. Words like peace, respect, or quiet. Your story matters. Please subscribe and hit the like button if you believe in the power of turning our deepest wounds into our greatest strengths. Thank you for listening.